Namaste, welcome to today's episode. ISOC Lesotho Chapter Digital Rights and Privacy podcast series. I'm Nthabiseng. Today we are joined by Nthabiseng Pule. Nthabiseng, please introduce yourself.
Thank you, Nthabiseng. My name is Nthabiseng Pule. I am a resident of Titani West in Masero. I am an avid member of the Internet Society and I'm very passionate about digital rights.
Okay, thank you. Can you tell us a bit of background why you are so passionate about digital rights and privacy?
For all my professional life, I have been involved in one way or another in technology, in the ICT sector, and as technology gets entrenched in day-to-day life, we realize some of the advantages but also the risks that people run on the digital space. So among the things that we recognized especially is the protection of personal privacy and what could change if policies or policymakers took the time to consider the risks and put in place the policies that can be both protective of people and while enhancing their welfare.
Okay, so you've talked about from a tech perspective.
Yes.
Now, as an individual, how does that impact you? Or how does digital rights or whatever the state we are in impact you on an individual?
If I take the context of Lesotho, often we are required to provide information, whether you're accessing government services or you're accessing normal services like banking, school, you apply for a place in a school, wherever in life, you find that in order to access a service, you have to give away a lot of personally identifiable information, which is my name, my address, sometimes my ID number or passport number. All those details, you just have to leave them with whoever is asking for them because you want to access a service. A more interesting one for me is wherever you access certain properties, you are right at the gate or at the reception required to provide your name, mobile number, where you come from,
who you're going to see.
It gets written in a notebook and then you leave that notebook behind there. You don't even know why this information is being collected because for heaven's sake, the reception doesn't know what you're going to do in that building, but you have to leave your details. You don't know how it's all going to be managed. And it's something that we can think is trivial, but I have had someone follow me based on the information that I had just written in one of those notebooks at one of the government buildings. So now when they find me, in fact they called voice, and somebody calls you and, hello, who am I speaking to? They say, you just left this other place and I noted your phone number. Creepy, isn't it?
Yes. So and this is something we do every day, everywhere we go.
Yes.
Yeah.
Then they even went to my office because I had written where I had come from.
Yeah.
Yes. And then they came, but it wasn't anything that endangered my life, but you can imagine that sometimes it may not end well.
It may be for malicious intent.
Yes. Yeah. And nobody, before you write or before you're asked to write, tells you why this information is being collected. For me, that by itself is an issue.
Yeah, I agree with you. So we already talked about how this touches individuals, but what other pressing issues do you think we have as a country in relation to digital privacy?
Having talked about the information that's being collected all the time by institutions, there's always the risk that there can be some kind of a security incident that results in the data ending up in the wrong hands, in the hands of criminals. And we are these days aware of the many incidents of identity theft. When your identity has been stolen through maybe a data breach in Lesotho, currently there's no obligation or there's an obligation in the law, but there's no mechanism for the companies and the other organizations to report a breach. So as a result, as an affected person, I may not even know that my data was compromised in a certain breach, and so that I can take precautions. In countries that have advanced in privacy protection, you will find that there's legislation that requires for the breach to be reported, and the circumstances around the breach are examined. If it is determined that the breach happened due to negligence, for example, on the part of the party that was controlling the data, then there will be some penalties. In Lesotho, there's no reporting mechanism. There's no...
Both by the consumers or by the corporates or the service providers?
Yes, by all the parties. And most importantly, there are no clear mechanisms how, once your identity has been stolen, how you are going to straighten out your life going forward. How do you avoid having your name cloned and used in sometimes illegal acts or in serious fraud, and you end up now having to try and sort it all out over years without ever having known how the issue came about, because you don't know what the information, where the information got lost. But it's also interesting, we're talking about what happens in a data breach, but for Lesotho, which is very much still paper-based, it's not just a technical breach that can happen. All the time we are told to photocopy your passport or your ID, get it certified somewhere, and you deposit it with some office. You never know what those people do with that information, or how well it's kept away from compromises.
So we've covered the instance of not being able to report, lack of regulation or lack of law or enforcement of the law. We've also talked about how to respond afterwards. So all of this talk about there are weaknesses already that we identify. What do you envision the future for in the realm of digital privacy for consumers? Where do you see in Lesotho specifically? What does the future look like, or what do we need to do to change this or to channel this to a better prospect in the future?
Because we do not know when the law will change, I think the most important thing is for the owners of the data to be empowered. People should be in a position to assess whether it's really necessary for them to give out their personal information in order to access a certain service, whether online or offline. And they should be in a position to ask those collecting the information about the security of that information. How secure is my information when I live with you? And what if something goes wrong? So I think the higher level of awareness among you consumers is what will drive change. Because even policymakers are consumers as well. Yes. So that's the thing that may drive change in the policy and legislation space. But an empowered user, an empowered citizen who is empowered with knowledge is the bigger part of it.
Okay, and I agree with you. We may have all technologies, policies, but it's us people at the end of the day who are going to be taking a bigger part in this, whether it's enforcing, whether it's reporting, and even knowing whether it's a breach or knowing what your rights look like.
Including knowing whether it's really necessary to give out that information.
Yes,
because you will find it's common for people on social media. I will send you an audio if you give me your phone number and name, for instance. And you don't know what the motive behind all of that is.
Why do you need my name, for instance, if you need to send me something?
Indeed, you don't know if people are just harvesting information over time to use it for certain...
Whether it's legitimate or otherwise? Okay. So we've talked about, from a user perspective, what can, now talking about corporates and service providers, what role do they need to play in protecting consumer data?
Okay. I will start with corporate business, the business sector in general. If you look at the human rights part of privacy, you will realize that businesses have an obligation to respect human rights, including digital rights. And if businesses do not keep the privacy of customers securely, then it means somewhere they are also failing to uphold their obligation to respect human rights. Also, companies have to ask for the minimum, the bare minimum.
Only what they need to use.
Only what they need to use. They shouldn't be, if they need my name and phone number, they should not also be asking for my ID, if the ID for that particular instance is not necessary. They should always collect only that which they need to execute whatever transaction I am executing with them, or if legislation requires them to collect only up to that and no more. So that when damage happens, at least it's minimized to what they were supposed to collect anyway, not anything beyond that. I will give an example of if you are applying for, or you're a parent, you are applying for a place for a child in a school, and they will ask for all your particulars, your name, and
both parents.
Yes, of both parents and everything. Then they start asking sometimes for even your banking details, and you're like, when is the school going to give me money?
Yeah.
So that's what we call data minimization. Don't take what you don't need, just take enough for what you need to do, so that if a damage happens, the impact is limited to a certain aspect.
There's one that always troubles me with applying for children's stuff, and then you ask, are you Christian, or what denomination do you follow? And I always wonder, what does this have to do with me and my child going to a government school, for example?
Yes, in fact, that is even more, when it comes to government, applying for your birth certificate or your ID, if you look at that form, you will see that quite a lot of information there is required than necessary. And you wonder why.
Okay. Talking about government, because we first started talking about the responsibility of corporates. So this means that there is also responsibility that government, as a service provider for essential services, must also be held accountable, or must also be very wary of the information they collect about consumers. But from where we're standing as end users, how do we influence government to also be wary of this, and not only to uphold companies, but for also of them being intentional about educating people? What can they do? How can we drive towards there for the government as well? And also, what can they do?
Okay, with government, when we talk about human rights again, government has an obligation. Remember the contrast. Business has the obligation to respect. Government has an obligation to protect privacy. So it means the government's responsibility is greater. They have to lead by example. And in this case, the government is the one that is the custodian of the only two instruments, which is the Constitution and the Data Protection Act, to protect our privacy. So we have to see government leading by example. We expect government to read and understand and see to it that in all government departments where personal data has to be collected, it is in line with the provisions of the Data Protection Act, even if we don't have enforcement for the Act now. But that example set by government would change the data practices or culture in organizations in the country.
Okay, you did mention that in the apps there is no enforcement of the act currently. But has there been any breaches reported and any penalties that has been granted anywhere in your past experience?
People talk about breaches, but because they are not officially reported anywhere, you may sometimes see a newspaper article that talks about it. But you never get to receive maybe a call or an email saying, be aware that you were affected in a certain breach, therefore take these measures to ensure that your identity is not used by fraudsters. Yes. So I would say at this point it's just really making. Nobody knows what's happening. In fact, there's a tendency for issues to be hidden and for consumers to never know exactly what happened.
Yeah.
That's the style of it in the country at the moment.
Not only in the country, even for the rest of the world.
Somewhere else.
Yes, corporates like to hide, maybe for good reason or otherwise, maybe as part of their business processes, not to be very forthcoming. And governments have been pushing so much that every time there's a breach, companies must come forth. I know that in the US, they are very strict about this. You need to report at least within specific timelines.
Exactly.
Technology's role. We have many emerging technologies, exciting things in technology. We have AI, we have blockchain, we have many other technologies. How are they impacting digital rights? How are they impacting privacy in digital space?
It's a mixed bag. Some technologies, by way of example, if we take the Internet of Things, they generally seem to make life easy for us because you now know that you will get notifications about this and other thing. You're able to track things. Your life shapes up.
Becomes easier.
But there have been observations that most of the technologies out there are not taking security. They are not designed with security.
Yeah.
So they are vulnerable to being compromised, so that personal information that we trust our IoT devices with ends up in the wrong hands. So as consumers, again, goes back to awareness, whether people are aware of the devices they put in their homes or in their cars, on their bodies, whether the technologies are actually secure enough not to compromise their personal information that's being transmitted between themselves and the devices and the homes and the cloud somewhere where all this data gets to be collected to. So it is something that people just need to be aware and be selective about what it is that they feel they can share their personal data with and what they don't want to share. That way they are at liberty. But again, corporations are the ones developing these technologies. They have to always put the privacy of people up front. For them, actually, it's a strategic issue because the moment your technology is known to be unsafe from a privacy perspective, then it falls out of use and you could easily run out of business.
They still need to strike a balance between, But would you say, personally, as Nthabiseng, if I decide to use an IoT device or something that collects my information, is it the technology provider or the technology company that is more responsible, or I'm more responsible in how I use the technology?
It's a balance. Sometimes the corporations will advertise features that people find irresistible, and we cannot assume that all consumers are so informed as to research enough about the implications of using a certain technology. I put a greater responsibility on the company owning the device or the service than on the consumer. But again, not to exonerate the consumer. The consumer also has to be vigilant about what they want to subscribe to.
Okay. We are almost at the end of our discussion. Thank you very much, Nthabi. I think what I liked or what I want to highlight from our conversation was whether from corporates, government, we need to be intentional with the user awareness that we do, that we provide to end users. We need to have more empowered users so that they are able to, one, know what information they are providing, what their information is doing, and to also be able to ask appropriate questions and to follow, to question every time we have to provide our information for whatever services we provide, but also from corporates or providers to only ask for essential information, not to be collecting everything. Sometimes they say it's for the future purposes or whatever, but for them to be aligned. In your ending, for instance, for Lesotho, what can you say is the immediate need that we need to address right away?
For me, primarily, it's that knowledge building, creating awareness, as I have said, setting up our legislation to be protective, because the legislation that we have now, even though it exists and it's still not being enforced, even if we had the data commissioner to enforce it, if you read it, you will find that there are very few deterrents in it. So what the data commissioner would end up doing would just be to report that this happened, because the obligation to report is there. But if even the service providers or data controllers, as they are called in the law, didn't report, the consequences for them, they can be ignored. Yeah. So the first thing is to develop a knowledge among the citizens, to beef up the legislation so that it becomes a real deterrent for errant service providers or data controllers, as they are called, and also for our legislation to be in line with the best practices in the world, because that's good for business, it's good for government, it's good for citizens. And lastly, consumers need to always have the means to give informed consent. We do not have to feel like we are at the mercy of data controllers or businesses to give our information in order to access a service. It has to make sense even to us that I'm giving this data because for a sensible reason.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you for your attention and your time. Please do check on ISOC Lesotho chapter on social media. We do have a series of awareness campaigns that talk about digital privacy, that talk about what we can do as end users. If there's anything you need to understand, whether it's cookies or what privacy means, please do follow us, and you will find more information about this. Thank you very much.